Hello, everybody. Welcome back to another conversation in building a bridge. My name is Jesse Brisendine.
My name is Jared Countess, and our mission is to empower people to use their voice to build a bridge beyond race relations, creating unity and understanding, effectively raising the collective consciousness of humanity.
In our last conversation Jared and I had, we talked about perception versus reality, and we set it to a framework of the question that Jared would have been getting a lot. You might be a racist if. And we posed a scenario of people standing on a street corner, and what are the layers that go into forming a judgment, a biased opinion, or what makes somebody a racist or not a racist around that, and all the layers of how we create our perception and therefore believe it's our reality. And if you haven't seen that one yet, we highly encourage you to go back, watch it, listen to it, because there's some really great opportunities in there to examine not just each other, but ourselves and our own behavior and how it shows up and manifests, and how it's often much more complex than just simply skin color. Today, we're going to continue our conversation on perception versus reality and start to talk about justice and compassion, and also introduce the discussion with policing. And I think it should be said too, before we get going, and I kick it over to Jared, that we both want to make it clear that neither one of us are in law enforcement, nor have we served in law enforcement. So this is just going to be whatever it goes into. What it will be a very sensitive and hopefully powerful discussion in the next several weeks. The initial conversation piece will be from two people who are just sharing opinion and observational opinions from what we see as citizens, what we know as having friends, family members serving in law enforcement, and also, trying to take in that spectrum. So we want to give that disclaimer. Jared, how you doing today, buddy?
Oh, cool, man. That's the best place to start, right? Because I told you before we got on today, I've been frustrated, right? I've been with the shutdown and COVID and just being stuck in the same place. I was talking to my sister yesterday, and she was like, it's like Groundhog Day. You ever seen that movie?
Yeah.
With Bill Murray? It's like you wake up, same place, same scenery, same thing, right? Same place, same scenery, same thing. And it's been frustrating, man. It's just like so much monotony, right? And then I live in Arizona, so I work out, and I try to that helps me with my mind. I do Tai Chi and I do all these other things, help me with my mind to keep my mind balanced. Anyway, as things opened up in Arizona, it's a long story, sorry guys. Things opened up in Arizona. I had started more meditation and all these other things, right, to make up for not having the gym, right? As things opened back up in Arizona, I had the gym again, and I was going to the gym again, and I kind of fell off with some of my other mindful practices that kind of kept me sane when the gyms were closed. And so when they went to shut down the gym again, I was like, and I didn't have those practices. And so my first step was to go outside and go for a run. And I went outside at 7:30. It was over 100 degrees outside. And I was like, oh, God. It was just like, I just went on a downward spiral of being angry, right?
Yeah.
And so when you talk about perception, right, your emotional state from another thing or just whatever else is going on in your life, that puts that red haze on your perception, right? So, I was supposed to be doing the work and looking under the rugs and stuff like that. But because things that usually don't bother me, right? Or maybe like it's just like a little annoyance, now it's magnified, right? Because I'm already upset, or I'm already just mildly irritable, right? So now any little irritant just that much more, right? And so this actually led me to get into an argument with a good friend and a client, and we were talking about this dynamic the whole week, right? Because this client is in the same place, right? They're also on edge, right? and so it was just like, and it was just one of those things where you start to go down that path with somebody, and you're both speeding towards each other, right? And you want to put on the brakes, right? And it feels like every time you put on the brakes, they accelerate.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
and
yeah,
so and so it's like when you see them speed up or not stop, you're like, well, fuck it, I'm gonna just keep
yeah,
driving at you,
yeah, yeah,
and then right.
yeah, yeah,
And so it happened, right? And so it happened. And we were talking about just earlier, like, and I was telling, you know, in their mind, it wasn't that bad, right? And I didn't have to respond the way that I did. In my mind, right, it was like, I asked you, don't cross this, whatever, right? And they drove anyway, right? And so, but they wouldn't have, if they weren't already in an irritable, upset mood, they wouldn't have drove towards me like that. Does that make any kind of sense?
yeah.
Right? And if I wasn't in an upset mood, the lane that they were driving in wouldn't have pissed me off. Does that
Yeah.
like if I'm in normal Jared, I don't care. You can drive in that lane all day long. Irritated Jared, my world goes like this and gets more and more like it gets more. I get less open-minded, and I revert back to what I told you was before when I was younger, which was my state of like, this is my circle. If you cross this line, then you want something from me. That, you know what I mean? Like you either want to take something from me or we got to go, right? And so it was through talking to you like earlier when we got on, like I recognize that sometimes like how I grew up, the world that I grew up in conditioned me to be more aggressive in certain situations, right? And so yeah, I don't want to get too far off track. Anyway, just was mad. I've been irritable, so that means the things that irritate me mildly, irritating me greater. And that's the perception thing.
Yeah.
So what it did was it brought some of those old things that are like back here, it brought them closer to the surface. That's what I mean when I say my world got narrower, right? Because I'm irritated, it brought anything that was like a mild annoyance that may have been when I was younger and a less integrated human and a less put together individual, right? You could tell already, like, don't fucking say that to Jared. Don't do that, right? Don't cross that line, right? Like, and then I've become a better man, more complete, right? But as I got angry, I get it, I was irritated about a lot of stuff, so it fucking vexed me.
Jared, some people, I appreciate
that opened you up earlier. I wanted to, you said something to me about your growth and how your perception changed from when you were younger, which was hard to believe. So you said something to me that I was like, what, Jesse, really? You felt that way? And I was wondering if you shared that with everybody.
Yeah, and I think real quick, I think what's really I appreciate about you is willing to acknowledge that. And it's such an important piece to acknowledge. I've grown up and played poker most of my whole life, and lately I found that on Amazon Fire you could get a poker app on there. And so I've just recently, these last few weeks, been replaying it again. And it's really fun because you're actually playing against people, but you're playing on the digital fake stuff and everything. And I was reminded of, in poker, one of the best times to play poker is when your opponent is on tilt. And what tilt is when somebody has played a hand and they had a good hand and they get what's called a bad beat. They had a hand that should have won, mathematically should have won, but some luck essentially happened, they lost. And that's a lot of times when the catalyst to get people on tilt, or they lose a couple hands in a row. Mm-hmm. And what tilt is essentially is you start to get really emotional. You start to get emotional and more irrational. Your world, as Jared was saying, starts to get really narrow. Your perception of everything changes. And so what you're looking at is all the stuff that fuels the fire of the frustration, the anger, the injustice that you're feeling in that moment. And so what happens in poker is when you have somebody in that state, they're not really thinking rationally anymore. What they're trying to think of is how do I get even? How do I catch up? How do I how do I get back at this person who just visited this injustice on me, stole my money because they got lucky and they shouldn't have been in the hand. And you love to play against that person because you know they're going to make bad mistakes. You know they're going to make bad decisions. I can remember one of the biggest poker pots I ever won. I was playing against this guy who was sitting to my left, and he was on tilt. He had taken a bad beat, and he went into a hand with me that he didn't have any business going in, especially if he had been paying attention to how I played. He's pushed all his money in. I knew I would have him beat. As soon as I called, he was already pulling his wallet out to buy more money back in. And there's a part of me that felt bad because I could see psychologically and emotionally what he's doing, but also the game of poker invites that kind of behavior, right? It's one of the things of it. So I really appreciate
play a lot of poker
that, Jared, because I think a lot of us, given the dynamics of the world, we find ourselves in a place where we're on tilt. We find ourselves in a place where we're more sensitive than we may be, that we are in this very narrow, we're not in a narrow way of thinking, but we're in a narrow, we might find our options narrowing because we're seeing all these obstacles that might not normally be there. And some of these obstacles are being vocalized more than they would normally be. And in that vocalization, there might be discussions or disagreements or arguments in ways there might not have been before. And when we're in a perception versus reality dynamic, right, we're often looking to see things that are going to justify the reality that we believe we're experiencing. And it becomes if we have this field of vision, we narrow it very quickly down to this so that we can focus on what is going to make sense of the world that we want to see or as we believe we see it.
Yes.
And I appreciate you bringing that up, man, because it's a very real thing. I definitely felt it so many times through this, and I can feel myself at times doing the same thing going into that. I think all of us can, and it's not an easy thing to talk about because when we're talking about it, what we also have to acknowledge is that we're still being this human animal that is responding to thousands, tens of thousands of years of programmed biology that, as conscious as we might like to say, or as awoke as we might like to think we are sometimes, we are still that human animal that is responding to us. Now, awareness can always precede transformation. We can definitely have these conversations and talk about it. And then hopefully that allows us to grow, evolve, expand, evolve, expand, evolve, expand. And that's where that raising the conscious piece comes from. But I think to even get there, we have to first acknowledge exactly that we end up on tilt at times. Yes. And that there can be people that are friends that we're like, that we know they're probably not meaning something by whatever it is, how we're perceiving them. But because we're perceiving them that way in the moment and we're making machines all the time, we're making a meaning that what they are saying, we're perceiving as they are trying to do X, Y, and Z to me or make me feel X, Y, and Z, which is whatever it is I'm thinking or feeling at that moment. And we don't ask them, hey, Jared, are you trying to make me feel pissed off? What we'll usually say is, dude, you're pissing me off.
No, you know what's crazy? I am aware enough to ask that question.
You are.
I am aware enough to ask that question. And it usually stumps people, and they're like,
yeah, nobody knows because you don't hear it. Self-destructs it really self-destructs the programming line because we don't do that.
Yes.
We don't ask the question.
Well,
make the statement.
Sometimes you do that and you try to break that person's program, and then they keep going anyway, right? Or they make an excuse and they're like, well, blah 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 blah, right? Or I ask the question I ask it in an ultimatum way, because by the time I'm asking you that question, I am pissed off, and so when I ask it, I'm not asking it in the terms of like, are you trying to piss me off? Like, I'm asking like, are you trying to piss me off? Like, because if so, then you do know the next step to this. The next steps. So, and that's the look of my face, the tone of my voice, and everything else. I'm like, and some people like to push buttons, like that. Some people get a rise out of that.
Absolutely.
I do not get a rise out of it, but I also don't, I don't know. I have to work on that. So I play poker too, right? And I am actually, the way that I play, I put a lot of people on tilt. So I play poker to the point, like when I first moved to California, I played poker was my profession for like a year, right? So like they just passed the tax deadline. I have to put poker into my taxes, right? So needless, I'm a decent player, but the reason I am not a great player is because of what you just said, right? It has nothing, and like if you talk to poker players, and like it's usually the mental game that separates people, right? And how you can maintain an even keel, like when you go through a downswing or something like that. Or even the worst part is, I don't know why I'm telling y'all this, but I'm telling you, hey, look, so we're there, right? So we might as well keep going. Expose all Jared's flaws and vices and everything else. So when I played poker, like exclusively, like when I played it like for a living, right, I had two issues, right? One, bankroll management, which is because poker is like you have to have a certain amount you can lose to win, but you win over the long haul, right? So one was bankroll management. Matter of fact, anyway, never mind. I was buying expensive stuff because it was like it's money, right? So you go out and you're like, oh, I made whatever tonight. I'll spend that.
What is it? Money burning a hole in the pocket or whatever.
Yeah. So that bankroll management, and two, when you really play poker, like for real, it can be boring as fuck. It can be extremely boring, especially if you're talking about like 6, 8, 12 hours, and like you're really there just to make money, and you make every decision you make is calculated, and it's just super monotonous. I already know what I'm gonna do before you put your bet out, before you put your card out. I'm already playing the last street. If this happens, blah 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 blah. It's just like boom 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 boom. So the second problem I would find is that I would want to gamble after I played. Like, so I remember this is a terrible story, but I'm going to tell it anyway. All right. So like I said, I don't mind. Fuck it, guys. You guys can judge me if you want. I remember I had played one night for like 7 or 8 hours, and I wasn't playing long enough to really move really high up. So I made like $600 or $700 that night, right? Yeah, about 100, which is decent. $100 an hour is decent for poker, right? Like if you're playing on the long haul. But it was such a hard. Sometimes you come in and you fucking make a couple thousand, right? Or and sometimes you don't, right? It was such a hard $600 to make. Like I literally made the right calculated decision like 99% of the time, right? And it was just like they call it grinding. Yeah. I just grinded, and so I was like on my way out, and I was like, oh, I'll play this little 3-card poker game and I ordered food, and I was like, I'll play this little 3-card poker game while I wait for my breakfast, because I've been there all night. My breakfast to get to the table. And I literally, in the 20 minutes that it took for my breakfast to get to the table, I lost all my winnings. I lost 8 hours of work because I got such a high from actually like gambling. I was just, and so that was like one of the first times that I really started to understand. Let's see if I got it here. Is it in here? Oh man. It's this great book called Willpower. I don't have it. Okay, it's this great book called Willpower, and it talks about willpower being finite. It's the whole premise of the book, right? And the premise of the book is you have to learn compassion, understanding with yourself, blah 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 blah, because you can have willpower, but there needs to be a reward, right? And you have to be cognizant of what the reward is, so that when you get it, you feel it, right? And that's how you restore your willpower. right? And we can break it down into a chemical thing, dopaminergic, serotonin, all that kind of stuff. And we can see as people use willpower, we can see their dopamine and serotonin levels drop, right? And so what ends up happening is if you've been using a lot of willpower, your dopamine and serotonin levels, specifically dopamine levels, are super low. So you're going to look for a dopamine spike, right? It's the same as a person that's in a really stressed out situation and they've been stressed for a long time. They're going to look for some kind of dopamine spike because their body is craving it because they haven't had a fucking sense of happiness and they've been fucking stressed for a long time. So what happened was I finished playing poker and it was just a grind for 8 hours straight of controlled, methodical decisions because I didn't feel good about making $600 because I had to work so hard for it, and I've made so much more money in such a short amount of time as a poker player, right? And it wasn't like I lost, so I wasn't happy, I wasn't upset, I was just like drained.
Yeah.
Right. And so then when I got that first little hint of a win, that dopamine spike, playing that damn game, in 20 minutes, I managed to lose all that money. Just not even like, just looking for that boost, right?
Yeah.
That high. And so, mind you, I've never played that game again. So
That's good.
Never again in life. I look at it and I'm like, like I've never played that game again. So I guess, what am I saying all that to say? I'm saying that to say I've played poker too. I understand the stress, but also to say that when you are stressed out or when everything else, you're more fight or flight type of behavior, right? So you go through life, right, in a stress, when you're in a stress state or in a higher stress state, you're either looking for something to make you feel good or to attack anything that makes you feel bad.
Yep.
And those are the only two. That's what this zone is. Everything else, I'm either I just want to feel good or attack the things that might make me feel bad. And you fall into that space, right? And the more we get here, the more we do this. And that is the like a huge essence of a problem, because then you're not really perceiving anything. You don't have, okay, I take that back. You're only perceiving advantage and threat. That's it. Advantage and threat. Benefit, negative, right? Black, white. Yeah. Nothing beyond that, right? And so I think part of the first step, and this is the hard part for everybody right now, part of the first step for us opening up our perception, right, is to get out of that fight or flight, get out of that threat advantage mentality, that I like it or I don't like it mentality, and say, well, are there parts of this that I like, right, other than the parts that I don't like? And then this thing that I like, are there parts of it that I don't like, right? And then being able to open ourselves up to be honest enough about it. Because when you ask that question, right, like they're like, okay, so I'm gonna dig on the police as a civilian, right? The black guy growing up. So what I would tell everybody, or I would tell people to understand, is that my grandfather was a cop, right? I spoke to my grandmother, what was it, a week ago, or a week and a half ago? And she told me, you know, as I'm on the phone, I'm throwing my grandma under the bus. Right? Your grandfather was a cop. I didn't trust cops. Your grandfather didn't trust cops, even though he was a cop. Don't just trust the cops. Cops ain't all good, blah, 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 blah. Right? Now, why does my grandmother have that perception? Because when she was young, in her community, cops really were not the good guys. Then my dad was 10, 11, 12, 13, 14 years old. He could turn on the news and see black people getting beat up by cops. So that colored his perception of cops going into his whole life, right? even though his dad was a cop. Am I making sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so that perception, and like I said, I talked to my grandmother a week ago, that perception of cops, don't get me wrong, does my grandma call the cops if there's a problem? Sometimes yes, sometimes no, but most of the time, yes, right? But she's seen kids in her neighborhood strip searched by cops, right? She's seen that in every orifice checked, on the street, in public, right? In her neighborhood was the same neighborhood I lived in, and that happens, right? And if you've never seen it happen before, you've never seen somebody make somebody spread their cheeks on the street in public, then you don't understand why some people's perception or how they perceive police may be different from how you perceive police. Now, was that officer doing his job? Possibly. Did he have to do it there? Right? Could he have taken that kid in or something like that? Probably, right? So it's you have like these layers, right? To how people see the police. Like we were talking about, there are layers, right? And so one of the layers of people in the Black community, I think people need to understand, is that their grandparents and their parents, right, had real live instances, which all of us can see. All of us can look back through the history of the United States and see these real life instances where police were not the good guys to that community at times, a large portions of time, right? In general, right? And so if you can look at that and see that, right, then you can understand that colors the perception. So that so it's like you see what the cop is doing and you only perceive the wrongs. Does that make any kind of sense? Because your information, your structure, your layers are built off of, well, this was the wrong I saw done here in the past. This was the wrong that my parents taught me to watch out for, right?
Yes.
And so when you see it, you only see that, and you build this barrier between, I don't know that cop or that police officer as a person. I only know them as an entity, right? And not as not as something else. And so what I wanted you to do after I explain that, I wanted you to invite you to talk about how you were raised to see the police, right? And what you saw from police officers when you were growing up, right?
Yeah, I appreciate that, Jared. And I wanna just help echo your point and ask you a question. What color is my shirt?
White.
And how do you know it's white?
Because it's lighter than your skin. Yeah.
But it's you've been taught that this color is white.
Yes.
Right?
There you go. I've
and
been
if
taught
you
that
had been taught and had been reinforced your whole life that this color is red, you would know it and see it as red, even though
yes.
I would tell you, well, this is clearly a white shirt.
Yes.
Right. And so I think that's a really important point to echo what you just said. Much of our perceptions have been taught on the specific instances that occur in our life that cause the most emotional arousal.
Yes.
Right. So if we have instances that put us in a state of fear, put us in a state of anger, put us in a state of joy, the extremes, that's why all of our lives are snapshots of specific moments. We don't categorize our day by the 24 hours we lived. We categorize our day by the one or two moments that had the greatest emotion attached to them. So we define days as good and bad, not based on the day in its entirety, but on the specific moments that happen each day. And that's not to say this is good, bad, right, or wrong. What this is to say is, because it sounds like some of those things that Jared said, and I think he said it in a really great way, there's some messed up stuff that happened, and maybe they were doing their job, maybe they weren't, maybe they were doing it, but did they have to do it in that way, right? There's all sorts of paths we could go down and we could discuss and debate. So just as a big picture of the human being, recognize that we're always attaching meaning to the moments that stand out, which is why most of us who are watching and listening to this right now cannot remember the color shirt that our child our husband, our wife, our girlfriend, boyfriend, whoever was wearing 3 days ago. Now, that's somebody that we would probably say, I love them more than anything. But if we're really sitting with it, we're not, because we're not paying that much attention. Now, if it was a special day or something significant happened, we might, or now since I'm prompting you, you might. But the truth of it is most of us don't even think in those ways. Right? And then we can say, we can romanticize it all we want. Well, I don't see the colors on my person, the colors that they're wearing or whatever it is. I just see the person I love. I see my wife. I see my husband. We don't have to even justify it. It's just recognizing that we all have perceptions that we have. And we're attributing that to whatever is going to have the most emotional significance and meaning. That's humanity. That's human nature. And so to answer now Jared's question about how I was raised with the police, growing up where I grew up, I didn't have such a life or death type dynamic that I think Jared grew up in. Mine was much more, you'd have more drugs. I grew up in Northern California, which is, I think it's still called the Emerald Triangle. It's Humboldt County has largely been one of the marijuana capitals of the world. It was a place that was, when I was a kid, it was really severely economically impacted because the timber industry was largely regulated and shut down in many ways. And you used to have a lot of there's still up there is some of the biggest redwood trees in the world. Well, some of the bigger mills got closed down because there's new regulations put down. And I think, at least as I understand it from my limited perception, it is many folks went from that and started growing marijuana because it was an easy crop to grow up in that climate and you can make a really good profitability margin with it. Well, with that comes other things. There's even a documentary on Netflix called Murder Mountain, which again, we'll talk about perception. That place is up there. And if you watch that with no other insight, you would look at it and think it's a wild, wild west up there of people killing each other over marijuana. Is there an element of that? Absolutely. Is there also the opposite of that? For sure, definitely. Right? There's only multiple sides to every story. But what I was raised and what I remember largely from the police officers is there was always a focus on drugs and those types of things. So I remember we had DARE program as a kid. I remember I wrote an essay about DARE, going through the DARE. The officer would come in. I still remember our DARE officer's name. It's funny. I can actually see his face right now. He kind of looked a little bit like one of the Mario brothers, Mario in a way, but just with a thinner mustache. And I remember him coming in and I wrote an essay and I got a little DARE pin because of it, and it was taught very early on having that the cops were supposed to be allies. Because what we were playing in the dynamic was drugs are bad. I just heard Mr. Mackey from South Park, drugs are bad, okay? And that was really it. We didn't have those dynamics we didn't really start to have, or at least I wasn't aware of more gang type presence until junior high and high school. And even then, the kids that we were hearing about that were in gangs, I remember there's one local gang called the Sags. That was what they were, because they're called the Sags because they would sag their pants down below their hips. But it was always kind of comical because I knew who these kids were. I remember having sleepovers at some of their houses when I was really young, and one of them being afraid of wetting the bed, and so now he's going to be a gangbanger. That was just how I attributed it to it. It was like, this is so funny. Like that would be, they're going to be gangs, because I would come down and visit family in Southern California where there would be really real discussions about Bloods and Crips, and that seemed so much scarier to me because I didn't know them, I didn't grow up with them, and that whole dynamic. So I knew these kids to some degree. And yeah, so, I always looked at it as that very much growing up, as there was this relationship of it. And I remember too, one time right when I got my license, I rolled a stop sign through town. There's a 4-way stop. I rolled right through it. It wasn't going fast. I just kind of rolled it because some of the first times I had friends in the car, we were trying to be cool, whatnot. And there was a cop right there. Cop pulls up behind me, puts his lights on, and my friend's mom owned this store, and we would go and play video games in the back of the store. And that's where we were going to play video games. And I went into panic mode. Not because of rolling the stop sign. I went into panic mode because I was so afraid. I knew I had done something wrong, and I was so afraid that then it was going to come back to, and I lived most of my life as a child trying not to get in trouble because I didn't want to upset my mom. And that here I was now had this responsibility and I was going to upset my mom. And most of my life, I had lived focusing on trying to manage my perception of my mom's unhappiness. And now I was going to break the law, which was going to really make my mom unhappy, which then in that moment made me feel like the ultimate failure. And I remember pulling in there and jumping out of the car, which probably wasn't the smartest thing to do. And, the officer shining his lights, telling me, stay right there, and give my license and everything. And it was just saying like, yeah, I'm so sorry. I wasn't, just did something stupid. We're just going here to play video games, not doing anything bad. Nobody's doing anything. We're just literally going here to play video games. And I'm really sorry. And he let me off with a warning. He left me off with a warning. And it's funny, I haven't thought about that for a long time. But those were my first two real encounters with law enforcement. The first one was through DARE. The second one was that there was some sort of space of, if I was honest and made an honest mistake, maybe that could be understood or forgiven. And that's from a very, very small town. And then growing up and having different experiences with people over time, and now looking at it from even, I think, a more global perspective, opinions have changed a little bit since then. I especially when we're looking at the dynamic that is playing out right now, I think it's very easy and convenient for, I think society, we've gotten brilliantly good at putting people in boxes.
Yes.
And we put people in boxes, not so much for us, but more so to make it clear how they are not like us and we are not like them. And we put them in boxes, just the same as I'm putting a we in a box right now, a broad generalization to put us all in the same boat together. So you have to forgive me if you're hearing this and you're immediately excusing yourself from the boat. This isn't to personalize this about you. It's just to try to illustrate a point. And, you can definitely talk about this afterwards. We put things in boxes. We put people in boxes. And in so doing, we remove accountability and responsibility in ourselves. We put people in boxes and attribute behaviors as them versus me. I would never this, they would never this. And this isn't to excuse. And I think what we're going to start to tiptoe into right now is going to be a much longer discussion on policing and where that goes. But I do want to say this, will I acknowledge that there are some police officers that do some really horrible shit, awful behaviors? Absolutely. Absolutely. And I also acknowledge that I think there's some police officers that do some really extraordinary, incredible things. That do some extraordinary, incredible things that for most of us, we probably can't even imagine what they have to go through and what they have to wade through every day. I think that and I'll also say this too, I think the policing problem isn't so much a policing problem as, it is, but it's a societal problem too. In the sense of, many of us live our lives so unbelievably blessed that we live in a world where we can send other people, because it's their job, to deal with the stuff that we don't have to, so we can sleep well at night. And are there some changes that need to happen? Absolutely. We can get in the whole dynamic discussion of what, if in the world that if it was me in charge, what would I like to see change and what that looks like and what you could. But I think one of the things that has to first happen in going into this is to acknowledge that there are human beings there. And if we put all those human beings in a box, in the same box as the really bad examples, we're not going to get anywhere.
That is the goal of the conversation, right? To me, so the first step when we start to talk about police or even to contemplate what needs to change, right? We need to understand what box are we putting police in? How are we perceiving them, right? And so that's why we really wanted to go, or I thought we should really go from perception versus reality to talking about policing, right? Because the reality of them being human beings, the reality of them having living lives and having having emotions, right? By the reality of them being affected by the world that's around them, right? And them having their own perception. And then the reality of they have a job to do where they go out and deal with ugliness. Their job is to deal with what's ugly, right? And then what can that do to a human being and their perception and stuff like that? Because it digs into that. If we can't see what glasses we're looking at them from, or what box we're putting them in, or how we're boxing them up, or how we even got to perceive them that way, right? Because when you told your story, I didn't even think about it. It reminded me of my first story, like my first time seeing the police, right? And I'll be honest, like the first time I saw the police, so the earliest memory that I can have of the police is watching them arrest my mother.
Wow.
Right. And so like when you said that, now and I went back there and I was like, oh shit, like, oh, okay. Like that is my that's my my first, like when I dig and I don't want to, I mean, like,
Can I ask you really quick though? Can I ask you really quick? Like, I'm like looking back at it now. Do you see like is it? I'm curious, like if you don't mind, and if you feel okay sharing this, like what is your reaction, and then also what is the validation of what grandma had been teaching you all along?
okay, so this was prior to grandma,
Oh, this was okay.
like
Okay.
teaching me
Okay.
that. So this is like literally like my earliest month. I think I was maybe like probably like 6-ish. Between, it's like one of those memories is so early, it's extremely hazy. I was like between 5 and 7. I remember we used to take a trip during the summertime to this place called Lum's Pond. Just having birthdays and stuff like that. Anyway, we were headed out there and we made a stop. And I remember we made this stop. My mom got out the car, I went, whatever. When she's coming back, literally, the police officer walks out right behind her, fucking grabs her, and whatever. My dad gets out of the car and I think he tries to deal with it, but he can't save her. Right? They caught her buying drugs, or she had bought drugs from an undercover or something like that. And so I had to be dad take me and my sister home and then drive back out to bail my mom out of jail, or see if he could bail my mom out of jail. Right. And so, I mean, that's, I guess, sometimes you hate to tell stories like that because, it's not just your life you're talking about, right? It's somebody else's, right? But yeah, no, that's my early instance. And so what that actually did for me was, if I look for like a root cause of like why you don't cause the police to solve problems, and that's why, because they take away the people you love. Right. And so that was my first right or wrong, right? Because that was really before I really understood right and wrong in a really integral way. Like I didn't understand right and wrong at that age, like really understand it, right? I didn't understand that this man was, I knew he was doing his job, but I didn't know, like, does that ever make any kind of sense? Like we played cops and robbers or guns or whatever, like somebody else said, and we did those things like shoot 'em up games and stuff like that. And it was even when we played cops and robbers, everybody wanted to be the robber, right? Nobody wanted to be the cop.
Boring.
I think it built that dynamic in me. Not to say the police were bad guys, but like if we have an in-house problem, solve it in-house. Don't call the police, right? And so and it built that. It was the foundation of that principle. I don't necessarily. I guess when I was younger, I might have looked at the cops as bad guys. Not really. I think because my grandfather was a cop, I knew that there were always rules, to cops, to policing. And that, so I knew that I felt that as long as I followed those rules in that system, I would be safe. And if I was wrong, I would have recourse to right the wrong. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I can give you, another instance with, a cop. I was trying to get into a club on New Year's Eve, and and I was arguing with the bouncer. So the bouncer wouldn't let me in, and the bouncer might have been saving my life, because I think I later found out like a whole, like, it was like majority of the people in the club were like members of one specific gang, right? And they were like partying it up, and obviously I wasn't a member of that, so it might have been not good for me to be in that club on that night, right? But anyway, he wouldn't let me in there, and I wanted to get in, and I looked rough at the time, like I had a fro, and my facial hair was all like blasted out, like, I wasn't really vulgar, but I was gonna have a good time anyway. But and so I'm arguing with this bouncer about him not letting me in because I got money in my pocket. Like, what's up? Like, let me in, right? And and then as I'm arguing with him, I feel like somebody comes up behind me. I feel his hand on the back of my neck. Somebody clips my feet, and I'm on the ground, right? And I turn, and I'm like ready to fucking go, right? Like, I'm like, okay. So I'm like turning over, and I see badge and face and cop, and I'm like, fuck, okay. I was like, okay, all right, cool. So then, I get up, sit up, fucking hands behind my back, cuff me up, talk to him. He's talking to me. It's like, gets my ID and looking at my ID, and I'm talking to him. I'm looking at his badge number and all this other kind of stuff. So anyway, he finds out that I'm not from like a neighborhood, whereas like I'm a threat. And he's like, well, fucking, it's like, I'm the fuck you doing down here, but get the hell out of here, blah, 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 blah. Gives me my stuff back. Well, as he's doing that, I'm talking to him. I'm like, well, what's your badge number, name, yada, blah. It's like, cause like in my mind, like if you arrest me today, right? One, you're wrong in the first place. You had no right to slam me on the ground like that. Two, right? If you arrest me, fucking, I want to know who you are so I can fucking file a report. You know what I mean? And I'm like, so maybe some will come from it, maybe it won't, but at least in the least of it, right? To be honest, like maybe the threat of it will keep you from fucking locking me up over New Year's fucking weekend. Cause I'll be locked up till Monday or Tuesday. I'll be locked up till like Tuesday. And it's Friday. I'm gonna be in jail for 4 days. I don't want to be fucking jail for 4 days. And if I am, you're right. Like I'm gonna file every report I can. Cause I'll be fucking livid, right? And and so anyway, they end up letting me go, and end up just not even partying that night. Fucking ruin the night. But so those are like some like negative occurrences with cops, but it was never a moment in my life, right, where I can literally say like I felt less safe around police officers. And that's probably and I know that there are Black people that are different from me where they did feel less safe around police officers. Am I making any kind of sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
But I decided not to go down that route. I wasn't into that lifestyle, right? Don't get me wrong, did I do wrong things and fucking whatever? Did I have a cop pull a gun on me and stuff like that before? Absolutely. But I never crossed that bridge where I like saw every cop as a bad guy, right? But I can understand why other people do, right? But I did cross a bridge where I typically don't call the police to solve any problem I have. Like I don't know, I probably need to get over that in life. But like, as I was actually talking to somebody else, I was like, well, don't depend on the police to solve your problems. Like, and so it's weird.
Is that the police's job to solve our problems?
Huh?
Is that the police's job to solve our problems?
Well,
right?
No, but yes, in some cases, it is, right? So in some cases, I feel like it is the police's, because again, their job, and if we recognize that their job is to deal with the ugliness of the world, like, like if you call, if there's a fire, you can run into the fire and try to save people, but you call the fucking fire department
Yeah.
because they're trained and they have the equipment to do so, right? If you're a regular everyday citizen, I would pray that the police are better trained to handle certain situations than you are, right? Just like I said, like, not having the correct governor, and then just other people not recognizing me as an authority figure, right? Like, what right do I have to tell you what to do? Like, that's not my job. Like, even if you did offend me or you did this or blah, 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 like me, like certain problems that if I were to handle in terms of seeking justice, I would be unjust in the act of going to seek justice.
Yeah.
And so that is what the police are there for. But like I said, I have an issue with that. Like, I have an issue with that. Like certain personal disagreements, or especially within family problems, even if I know that violence might be the outcome, right? I would rather handle it in-house, even though it would be better and safer sometimes to contact an authority, right? Like the police officer, you know what I mean? But it's a tough question. And again, we just walked down this whole thing, and I guess we're getting into that justice and compassion piece, right? Again, right, whereas like, and it's again those blinders. We try to think of justice here and compassion here, or just maybe they're left and right. Justice is on this side of the equation, compassion is on this side of the equation. When really and truthfully, they're kind of like this, right? And sometimes the really just thing looks really discompassionate, and sometimes the really compassionate thing looks really unjust, right? It's like, and it's you hope and pray you can create police officers, human beings who mesh that perfectly, right? They're the hand of great justice, then the ultimate compassionate human being. But it's very hard because those two things are often.
Yeah, and we're asking them almost an impossible task, in the sense of it's something probably most of us, if we're really honest, we can't do it ourselves without the training of a police officer.
That's my
Yeah.
point of.
Yeah.
Still, what are we at? Yes, we're asking them to handle that shit.
Yeah.
Like it's their job. Certain shit,
Yeah.
I need to be able to ask police officers to handle. But again, I think the piece that scares us when it comes to family or personal disagreements is we're afraid that they won't be compassionate with the person, even though we're not even in a compassionate place anymore. By the time it's there.
Yeah. It's fascinating. I remember, Jared, going on a ride along with a police officer in Santa Barbara 9 years ago. And I got there and they had said, you're supposed to dress like more formally for the ride along. And so I had worn a jacket, and it was a colder night, and I had got there and the front door of the police station was locked. So I was like, oh shit, I'm late, even though it was early. And so I'm walking around the side trying to find it. And I had my hands in my pocket because it's cold, not thinking of anything. And I'm walking up there, and the officer who was going to do my ride along asked, are you Jesse Brisendine? And he said, yeah. And he said, just, hey, if you're ever going to walk up on a police officer, you probably shouldn't walk up on a police officer in a darker alley with your hands in your pockets. And I thought, and so at first it's kind of like whatever, but now thinking about that in that context with you, what we're talking about right now, I think it's a really incredible metaphor. Like it's something that for us, it's a luxury to be able to put our hands in our pockets when it's cold. It's a common sense thing. If it's cold, I want to be warm, put my hands in my pocket. In a police officer's world, when you're trained to deal with criminality, and you also are trying to mitigate threats to yourself, to the community, hands not visible is a threat piece, right? It could be a realistic threat, and there's a time where those hands coming out could have a weapon. we have, I think so many of the judgments we pass are on the instances we see that get the widestream publicity of what police officers do. And there's probably a lot of ones we don't see that they've done that haven't been the right decision. And unfortunately and tragically, it results in loss of life or something horrible happening to people who shouldn't have ever had anything happen. And it's also, I think, and that's not to say that is right or wrong. I think to actually go in and start to solve problems, we have to start solving problems by offering solutions versus a lot of it. I feel like most of the chatter doesn't go past right and wrong discussions or yelling or screaming.
Yeah.
And it's like you and I were talking beforehand, and I'll just throw this out there. And if Jesse had control of the world for a day, and I could make policies about different things, and this is just, again, as an outsider, a student of humanity, if you will. If an officer had an 8-hour shift, I would mandate that the last, maybe 45, maybe 30 minutes of that shift, so they're out and doing their thing for whatever, they have to come back and talk with somebody, a counselor or a mental health person or a therapist, whatever it is, and have that become part of the culture. Because I think one of the things that we're asking of anybody in a uniform, whether it's police officers, military, fire personnel, EMTs, doctors, etc., is we are asking them to bear burdens that most of us are incapable of bearing ourselves, or we don't know how to. And we are asking them to not only bear burdens, but then to stuff it down, suck it up, and then get back out there and deal with it, because there's more stuff to deal with. We can talk, like, I think that compassion justice piece is so fair. And we wonder, like, why is this happening? Well, going back to what you said early on with poker, right? When you're grinding it out like that, it feels like such a blah feeling. You're stuffing, and you're looking so much for just a hit of something, some sort of release. I can imagine, and maybe people in law enforcement can chime in too. I get that it's part of the job. I get that. I get that mantra or that code that we take on, that we are taking that on to do that. And I also understand as a human being that when we see and experience really rough and horrible things, and we're stuffing it down, we all have a capacity. And at some point, like, where does that capacity explode? Where does that release point come from? Whether it's going and gambling $600, or it's. I heard some statistic last year in the fire department that suicides are starting to outpace on death dramatically, or cause of death from occupational. These people are stuffing. Why? But then it's a cultural thing, right? So if you go and talk to somebody, are you fit for duty? Are you crazy? You're losing it. What if there's a cultural shift where it's just a culture thing that every day, end of it, 30, 45 minutes, you're going and talking with somebody. And so it becomes comfortable and talking about your feelings, talking about how you're feeling. And that's not to vilify you or make you weak or anything else, but we start to empower our officers with discussing emotions and how they're feeling. Yeah. And working through those types of things. Maybe there's something there, because if we're sending people out into situations where they may or may not have to, they have to go out with a understanding that there could be danger onto them, that these are also human beings that have families behind the scene, friends, people that they love and care about. And then we're asking them to make split-second decisions that may or may not cost them their life. I think that's a tough thing. And again, it's a horrible that the wrong thing happens to really good people. It's awful. And if we try to police by the horrible things that happen, and we're judging them as a whole from that perspective, that's another challenge, because I know plenty of people who are in law enforcement that they don't feel that way, and they would condemn the bad stuff, and they have when they see it happening, they're saying, gosh, that's not who we are. But they're also in a place right now, because they wear a badge, because they wear a uniform, they are really struggling with feeling like now the world hates them. And so now right? And
that's that is, I think so. I have my one buddy who's a former cop.
Yeah.
Right? He's a former homicide detective, and he now has you guys don't know, he has a nonprofit called Compassion Alliance, which does just that. They provide anonymous mental health assistance to first responders, police, EMTs, firefighters, former prior service military. And so that those people can go and seek help and get the help they need without having to make that an official report, to have their medical insurance paid for it. Because once you do that, then it's an official report and people higher up can look at it, right? And so it becomes, even just the fact that you went to see somebody becomes reviewable data, which can negatively impact your career, right? And that's just real, right? That's where the culture is, and tough guy image and all that kind of stuff. So it's important. So hopefully Tony will come on like in the next week or so. Like he's definitely going to come on during the police talks. I won't let him not come on. He's going to get on here. But we'll see it. We'll see if it's next week. Hopefully it'll be next week. Waiting to hear back from him on that. But I guess one more thing before we end it. The police and compassion piece that we're talking, the justice and compassion piece that we're talking about, I want to give a lot of credit to a guy named Rob Marinelli, who's in the group. And he had mentioned justice was the value he wanted to teach his kids. And I said, oh, you must have boys. And he said, no, I have a boy and a girl. And he's like, I struggle between justice and compassion. And it just opened up this whole thing where I was like, okay, Jesse, we got on today. I was like, we got to talk about justice and compassion. Like, and just when we talk about police and how difficult it is for just a regular person to embrace that, let alone a person who regularly sees ugliness or the ugliest side of the world, to both be compassionate and just, right? Especially when it's just really difficult, right? It's really easy to get here and paint black and white.
Yes.
Right? And the more horror we see, the easier it is to be there. So when you can see that people are able to keep their mind open and treat each person as an individual and not just see them as threat, friend or foe, threat or whatever, then it's a hard trait. And, guess my story from starting off today is I like to think of myself as a really put together person, but obviously, I fall into that, right? I fall into that, right? In various circumstances and cases in my life, whereas I can see the cars speeding towards each other and I can't switch lanes, right? I get to a point where I'm just like, we're going to go, right? And so when you do see police actions and things like that, you have to ask yourself, right? Or you have to be like, how many times are they switching lanes, right? How many times are they able to fucking do like, all right, I'm not going to meet you with the force that I could, right? And then you see people do, right? And you're like, well, that police officer, wasn't right in that situation. You'll see other police officers, like you said, some condemn, some don't. Let's keep it real. Some condemn, some don't. But it's recognition of how hard the job is, and then not having the support that you need sometimes to be open, right? Not having that, and other than a bottle or shit talking, right? Which doesn't really necessarily help bring you out of this, right? It just helps suppress. Again, it just helps compact, right? It helps you become more numb, and that's super dangerous. Super dangerous,
I think it's an opportunity, Jared, for us all to look at and ask ourselves the question, what do we choose to believe?
Yes.
right? Because what we choose to believe, the narrative we choose to subscribe to, is going to dictate in large part how we choose to see the world. That perception we focus in on.
What are we, again, go back to the, am I racist if, right?
Yeah,
Or are you racist if? What are the layers that you're building into that?
yeah,
Like not just what am I choosing to believe, but how am I coming to that fucking belief in the first place?
yeah,
Like, am I being real, right? Or am I just like, is this all perception and conjecture, right?
yeah,
Or am I able to include, like, all of these other instances and all these other occurrences, all these other variables that actually add substance to the equation, that make that person in that uniform, both what that uniform represents and who they are, but and a human being in
yeah.
it, right? Are we? Because I guarantee you, on both sides of the issue, right? There are people who are just looking at the uniform and seeing good, right? And forgetting about the person. Right? And there are people who are just looking at the uniform and seeing bad and forgetting about the person.
Yes.
When the truth is in the middle,
Yeah.
right? And again, like I said, like I would say, I mean, the vast I see the thing that says 99%. I would say the vast majority of cops are good, or else we would have real fucking issues. This would have been an issue way before, way before people talk about it now. But, like, you know, there is such a thing as catching a good person on a bad day,
Yep.
right? And that's real, right? And you can catch a good person on a bad day, and bad things can happen. Which is why, like I said, I want to have, his name's Tony. I want to have Tony on so he can talk about the Compassion Alliance, and so you can kind of mitigate the bad days, right? Um, and because yeah, so I'll be super clear. I would say that the 99.1 is true, right? Say the 99% cops great, 1% piece of shit, POSs, right? But I would say you can probably throw in another 10% that you don't want to catch on a bad day. You know what I mean? That
Yeah.
you don't want to catch on a bad day. And if we can find processes to help people mitigate the bad days, and those are also sometimes the ones that guys are much, much less likely to go out there and say something on. Like, because that's their friend, that's their buddy, that's their da 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 da.
Yeah.
He was really rough with that person, man, but he's going through a divorce, right? Or his wife, he just found out his wife just cheated on him.
Yeah.
Or, like, you know what I mean? Or, because I think that happens to cops quite often, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's the thing that happens to cops, because you become so emotionally distant that it's very hard to have a productive relationship with people you care about, right? When you have that kind of a job. Anyway, TMI, too much information. I think I'm digging too deep for today, but justice and compassion. We're gonna fucking dig on it. Bring my buddy Tony from Compassion Alliance. I'm gonna make Jesse say some things that he's gonna be like, I don't know if that makes me look good. We'll see if I can get him there. He always gets me there. We'll see if I can get him there.
Yeah. Jared, I love that distinction. 10% you want to see on a bad day. I've never heard that said before, and I think that's such an incredible distinction. And it gets back to that piece of, if we play in that world, if we what we believe, like the 1%, it's the same. We know of the instances where policing went wrong. Do we know the names of all the times it went right? Or all the people that were saved? We don't, because we just think, well, that's what they're supposed to do. But those are still human beings out there. Yet,
Yeah.
if we are, and most of us, if we were ever to do a good deed of some sort or have some sort of significant thing, we would often, that would be our drinking story we tell for the rest of the time, our lives. At one time when I did this, right? So I love that you said that 10% on a bad day. I feel like maybe even that number might even be bigger because that's the human part of all of us. I know if I had a bad day, there's not, you don't want to see me on a bad day, and so, and I don't have that kind of responsibility where I'm making life or death decisions for the most part. So yeah, man, I'm looking forward to having this conversation evolve with you. I'm looking forward to chatting with Tony and also wanting to open it up to where other people who might be in the group or in law enforcement know someone who's in law enforcement that might be open to having discussions with Jared and I about this. Like, I think that would be really invaluable to, I think this will probably be this is a pretty, really, I think this is a lot of, gosh, what's the word I'm trying to say? Heated discussion to have, but it's also one that needs to have. And I think it's one that if we're all going to grow together, this is a really incredible space to grow in. And on that space of justice and compassion, what Jared said, many of us want to have the justice piece right away. To get to justice, we might have to extend some compassion to one another, especially as we talk through this. And as each of you contribute, which we invite you to do, sometimes we're so quick to want to defend or to point out why our perception is right. I encourage you and challenge all of you to ask questions instead of pointing things out. Ask questions of everyone. Why do you believe this? What experiences in life have led you to this? And then when they explain it, don't devalue them for that and just say, well, that's completely out there wrong, but ask them more questions. Consider that every person who comments, every person who contributes has something to teach you because they've lived a different life than you have. They see the world through a different set of glasses, and that doesn't make neither one of you right nor wrong. What it does make you both is it makes you both people who deeply care about humanity and are genuinely wanting to see positive change in the world, as are all of us. So again, treat one another, and this isn't to say we aren't, but it's to challenge you all to level up your compassion and extend to each other as you have discussions about this. If you normally give points, ask questions. If you normally ask questions, give points. There's a beautiful reward that can come in risk, and that is that we all can learn and grow together. So
Yeah,
um,
100. This, I, I think I don't want to go too long. I think we probably should end it. But I think that the toughest part about getting a cop on or having someone be able to, some people be able to see the humanity of a police officer, right? And see them as a human being outside of, is so the profession, and even in the military, right? It's so, you're taught to be such a John Wayne type individual. You know what I mean? I don't talk about emotions. I don't show, the only emotion that's safe to show is anger.
yeah,
Right. And when you, unless you know people like that, like and are close to them, then you don't know the other sides of those emotions, right? Or sometimes when you're close to them, you really don't know it, or you just you but if you're too close. But like if you don't you're not around enough of that, then you don't know that those people think and they feel and they have to cope and about, you know what I mean? They have real emotions, but the job makes it so John Wayne. It's so that bravado image, right? And then you try. I think what the failure is that nobody wants to corrupt that by coming out and being human. Like if you had cops, like you see, I've like seen posts every once in a while, right? And I've seen some female cops. I saw a female cop post, and she was like crying and all this other kind of stuff, and it went viral. But you very rarely see like male guy cops get on there and say like and voice any other feeling or emotion than anger. Does that make any kind of sense?
yeah,
And so it makes it hard for people to who don't understand to have that empathy and compassion or whatever, right? That don't, because and that's not you'd be fucked up if you saw a cop out in the street crying in front of you. You know, you don't want to call a police officer and see them being like, you know, you want to see them taking care of business, handling the ugliest situations in the world, right? And so anyway, too much information. But I could go on and on and on and on this. That's why we're gonna make this like last for a little bit longer. But that's you just like you said. The first is, you know, what do you choose to believe, and then what are you using to build that belief? All right, I gotta stop. Jesse. I think we've been on here for like this has been a long one.
All right, everybody. We look forward to your comments and your discussion. So let's remember, safe space, support one another, love on each other, and we're all building this bridge together. We'll see you next week, everybody.